Welcome to the next installment of School Finance. Today we're going to be looking at a series of school and district SEEK reports. Enter full screen here. These reports can be found in the content section of Blackboard, and the title is District SEEK Reports. My advice is that you pause this recording and find copies of these district SEEK reports so that you can make reference and notes to them as we talk. So what is included in this handout are the SEEK reports from 4 school districts. First district that is included is Owensboro Independent, which is the district where I serve as superintendent. The second district is Davis County, which is the county school district that is partner in Owensboro. And of course, Owensboro is part of Davis County, so we are an independent district within Davis County. And then the other 2 are a little more far removed from this part of the state, and they are Jefferson County and Fayette County. And I include these as illustrations not only of what larger districts look like, and I know some of you are from Jefferson County, but I also want to look at the varying levels of property value and poverty in each of these areas to see what that does to the funding in each separate school district. So as we talked about last time, SEEK, or Support Excellence in Education in Kentucky, is essentially a calculation and an allocation that's given to districts that has several components. What we've talked about is the guaranteed base funding, which my cursor is pointing at, and that's $3,981 per pupil. And of course that is based on the overall funding that is given by the General Assembly in the biennial budget every 2 years. And that is a number that they come up with, and it is a number that districts around the state essentially inherit from the decision made by the General Assembly. We'll start with this far left box, and this far left box in the far left is the overall property assessment in the Owensboro Independent District. And you can see there's lots of numbers. 1.4 billion is the overall property assessments, and I'm going to shift between the districts. You can see Davis County's is 5.3 billion. Jefferson County's is over 70 billion, obviously a much larger district. And Fayette County's is almost 30 billion. I'm going to shift back here. If you look at the bottom corner here, you can see what the statewide equalization is, and that is the overall, the average per pupil assessment at the state level. And you can see it's $783,000 per pupil. That's the average. So you go to the next line and you see how Owensboro stacks up to that. You can see $341,000. That is the average property value per pupil in our district. Again, let's go back and see Davis County's is higher, but it's still lower than that $783,000. You can see Jefferson County now is higher than that $783,000. And you can see Fayette County is also higher than that $783,000. Why that is important, and we talked last time about a program called Tier 1, which is an equalization program that helps those districts that have higher or lower property levels get additional state funding. That's the 150% of the overall level. And so you can see going into the middle column, the Tier 1 funding for Owensboro, for Davis County, because they are both below the statewide equalization per pupil of $783,000. But notice that Jefferson County zeros, Fayette County zeros. And so that's a way that districts that have larger concentrations of poverty and lower property values get additional funding based on the level of equity that came through CARA. Okay, so continuing into this far left box, you see ADA and you see growth and prior year average daily attendance. And this is essentially the average attendance in the district. Okay, and you can see 4,330 students. And then remember we talked about the overall SEEK funding and how that is tied to having add-ons based on the number of students that are living in poverty and other at-risk factors like special education, exceptional children, limit English proficiency. And so you can see this is the overall number of students in each of these categories. So you can see 3,300 of the 4,300 are at risk. That means they qualify for free and reduced lunch, and of course get an additional add-on factor of 0.15 in the allocation. So that's additional money. You can see going over to the SEEK calculation per pupil, that adds $465 per pupil, which amounts to $2 million additional dollars for at risk. The same thing with exceptional child. Okay, and of course that's broken down into 3 categories based on December 1 child count: low, severe, okay, moderate, and high. And of course that refers to not the severity of disability, but the number of students that are typically identified. So high means that it's high incidence, lots of students in speech. Moderate means it's moderate incidence. Low is lower incidence, but typically more severe. So you can see the weighting there is a lot higher, 2.35, compared to moderate, 1.75, and high incidence, 0.24. All that translates over to an additional $714 per pupil and an additional $3 million for students that are served in special education programs. Okay. Same thing with English language learners, limited English proficiency. Students that have those needs are typically served with, again, an additional English proficiency, which is a 0.75. And you can see mapping that over only $18 per student, $78,000, not much there. Okay, so that is how the overall SEEK funding formula is calculated. And when you get to our budget assignment in this class, you're actually going to do a spreadsheet where you have to add these in, and you have to do, or the Excel spreadsheet will do these calculations for you. So you can see how in our district this changes from our base funding of $17.2 million to $23.4 million. So all that is dealing with the different population demographics that we serve in our district. That is calculated to the base funding. So our real per pupil is about $5,400 per student. And let's do a comparison then in looking at the other districts. And again, you can see the totals in the Davis County district is their average daily attendance is a little above 10,000. You can see about half of their students are at risk. And you can see where the additional populations that they serve on a per pupil basis, again, their average daily or their calculated base calculated additional funding per pupil is a little lower than the Owensboro district because the needs are a little lower. Looking at Fayette or Jefferson County, you can see they have a very high need population. Okay, the at-risk population there is 60,000 of the overall average daily attendance of 87,000 in the Fayette County or in the Jefferson County schools. So you can see the calculated base funding with all the add-ons in addition to the guaranteed base is about $5,500 per pupil there. So it's a little higher than Davis County and even a little higher than Owensboro based on their concentration of poverty and their demographics. Okay. And finally, look at Fayette County. Theirs is a little bit lower. Again, their level of need with that risk population is also high, but not as high as Jefferson County and not as high as Owensboro. All right. Moving on through and looking at the other elements of this calculation, we talked about Tier 1 and how that works. But we also mentioned in the SEEK overview that we did the 30-cent local effort. This is the 30 cents that you're supposed to collect to qualify for SEEK funding from your local tax base. And of course, this is subtracted because it is a required local contribution for you to get the state money. So they subtract it out of your allocation, and you can see what that amounts to on a per pupil basis, and you can see what that amounts to then from the standpoint of your total budget, at least in the Owensboro district. And so going on down, we've talked about Tier 1. You can see the state Tier 1 equalization because our per pupil assessment is below the state equalization. Owensboro qualifies for an additional $2 million in Tier 1 funding. Davis County qualifies for $2.7 million in Tier 1 funding. You can see Jefferson and Fayette, because their per pupil assessment of taxes does not qualify them for Tier 1. From an equity standpoint, they have additional resources on the local level that Owensboro and Davis County don't have because the value of their property that's taxed is lower. And that's part of the equity piece that came with the passage of the Education Reform Act in 1990 and created this SEEK funding formula. Okay, so there's a lot of other numbers here. We're not going to focus on those. So you really focus on how that adjusted Tier 1 is added on. And of course, transportation is another piece that we won't talk a whole lot about, but it is a funding formula that essentially controls for the size of the district. A district like Owensboro is not going to get as much. It is weighted by the number of students that you're transporting, but also it is weighted by how much mileage you have to drive. You can see Owensboro is an independent district with very small boundaries. Davis County, you can see, is going to get $3.5 million. And of course, the larger districts and larger population areas are going to get significantly more transportation funding. So moving into one or two other points to make here. Facilities are funded through Nichols, and you can see the bottom left corner, the Nichols calculation. FSPK is the school facility construction program that essentially districts are to take 5 cents of their overall tax rate and dedicate it to facilities. In Owensboro's case, there's one nickel that supports $730,000 a year, and the state matches that, and actually the match is a little healthier than just a match. And so that together is how bonding capacity is developed in districts, because these nickels fund the facilities that come from the state. You can see some districts like Davis County that are a little more growth oriented get an additional nickel and equalize funding for those nickels from the state. So they get 2 nickels locally and 2 from the state. Jefferson actually gets only money because of their funding model with state equalization. They don't get a state nickel. Fayette County is the same way. So everything that they do is funded through the nickel. that they tax their local folks. They don't qualify. So again, you see that equity piece factoring in looking at these four very different districts. But the similarities are there in the way the funding is formulated and it's passed down. Very definitely part of the way funding works. So if you're looking at what the total state effort is, you look at the total state SEEK amount, you go to the far right, the overall calculation, which adds all these different adjustments based on at-risk and exceptional child, home hospital, English proficiency, and then any prior year adjustment sometimes takes place if you have adjustments based on early graduation, January growth, or if your enrollment changed significantly from September to what you reported back at the beginning or the end of January the year before. And then, of course, you see the local effort and the capital outlay that are subtracted, and that's where your total SEEK amount comes from. And you can see what that total SEEK amount looks like based on each of these districts. 35 million in Davis County, okay, 225 million in Jefferson County, and you can see 86 million in Fayette County. And so that's an overview of how to read the state funding formula. Hopefully you can find this, and this is available on the state website. If you go to SEEK, KDE's SEEK page, and you can find the SEEK calculations. There are several different times of the year that this report is generated. This one was generated as the tentative allocation, which is generated in September. That's probably the best one to look for right now. And you can print these off for your district, and you can read it and get an insight into how the overall SEEK and state funding works in your school district.